Hello again, everybody. It's about that time again this week. Welcome to episode 15 of Sword of the Spirit. Now, anybody ever remember the old detective show? They run reruns on it now called Columbo. There was a great line that, everybody knew what was coming next when he walks away from the main suspect and he goes, just one more thing. Well, we have that same circumstance here. Actually, two more things. And because I said as more and more understanding comes out regarding the things we've spoken about over the past few weeks with regard to Revelation, Jezebel, Esau, bloodlines, lineage, inheritance, the areas that we spoke about are not nearly the only areas that it's talked about. So I want to go back to a not often quoted book called Lamentations, which is right after the book of Jeremiah. And in chapter 4, all right, we understand that it's very clear that Israel's days of punishment have concluded. Okay, they've come to an end. Chapter 4 is basically poetry, Hebrew poetry, as much of the Old Testament, and the use of a literary technique called chiasma. chiasma, chiasma. And what chiasma is a repetition of a specific point or a reiteration of a statement, back to back even within the structure of the Hebrew poetry. And it's really to reinforce the information that's being put out there and the statements that are being made. So it's a common literary technique that is used in the ancient Hebrew Bible. Now, the names of Edom and Uz and Zion have noteworthy understandings, okay? And I believe they present a clear prophetic message about the times and the seasons and what is to follow, and specifically the end of Esau and Edom. All right, these things are consistent in Lamentations 4 with what we studied in Revelations. And let's go back again. Esau, Edom, means dry red earth, like the clay. Okay, you know that old song, 100 pounds of clay. Okay, well, that's what Edom really means. It's a man that's earthbound, no real spiritual redemption. But the word Esau also has a deeper meaning, and it means the blood and his doings. And we know what type of a fellow Esau was. All right. So take a peek at that. Look at it retrospectively in terms of what we studied over the past several weeks in Revelation. And now, for that, just one more thing in Revelation itself. Because what we're going to go into in the book of Hebrews is going to be a predecessory antidote, not an anecdote, but an antidote of what's coming in Revelation and toward these end times. But let's look in Revelation 10, where they were speaking about the little book and the seven thunders. He said, don't write these things. And it says in verse 7, please note, but in the days of the voice of the seventh angel. Now remember in Revelation 16 what the seventh angel does with the seventh vial. The seventh angel, this is after now, Yeshua's only comment in Revelation 16 is in chapter 16, verse 15, behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watches and keeps his garments, lest he walks naked and they see his shame. And he gathered them together into a place of the Hebrew tongue called Armageddon, which is referenced in Revelation 28. But then comes the seventh vial. This is after the unclean spirits and the drying up of the rivers and turning to the water to blood and etc. And the scorched earth. The seventh angel pours his vial into the air, and a great voice comes out of the temple saying, "It is done." When I say done, it is done. There was thundering, lightning, earthquake, not like anything since man, and not so great has ever happened before. The city was divided in three parts, crumbled to the ground. Every mountain and every island fled away. There was great hail and more plagues, and they were exceedingly great. So in Revelation chapter 10, verse 7, listen to what it says. Think about it is done. But in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he shall begin to sound, listen now, the mystery of God should be finished, as he hath declared or revealed to his servants, the prophets. The mystery of God should be finished. And in Revelation it said, it is done. So, we have to think about what exactly is the mystery of God. Well, everything that we don't know, everything is revealed in clarity, such that there's no way to say, I didn't know, I don't understand. None of that. That's not going to be acceptable. Here we go again with this thing. Come on. Get up there. You ever see such nonsense? Okay. Well, anyway, so you say, okay, so what does all that have to do? We know that you're tying up some threads, some loose threads from the study on Revelation. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that there are direct applications and direct references in the book of Hebrews, which is where we're going to study. Okay? That's our position. We're going after Hebrews now. And during the course of that, I'm going to do some reading. I'm going to read the scriptures to you. But I think I'm going to read them in a way that will give you and all of us a much stronger identification with what's being said. The interesting thing about Hebrews is that the anticipated date is for writing was around 70 A.D. I got a little hard time with that. And the reason being is because there's no mention of the destruction of the temple or the diaspora or anything of the Roman armies. And that went from 67 AD to 70 AD. So it seems to me that it didn't take quite 30 years for Paul, which I believe this is Paul, has written this. There's speculation. They say they don't really know. But from my perspective, why I say it's Paul is because of his precise dissecting of covenant understanding and requirements and the evolution of the emerging covenant, the new covenant, which we're going to talk more about. Paul was a rabbi, a Pharisee rabbi taught by Gamaliel himself, or Hillel rather, not Gamaliel, Hillel, all right, who was alleged the greatest rabbi of the day in Judaism, in the Pharisaical group. So it's not a stretch to understand the way this is laid out in Hebrews that not only, but predominantly somebody of Paul's background and capability would have said it. However, I don't think it was 30-something years after the Messiah. I think this is back in closer to 60 AD, somewhere thereabouts. And another reason I say that is because the things that are referenced here in Hebrews are direct references in the book of Revelations, what people say typically wasn't written until about 120 AD. I disagree with that as well. I believe that it was John who was called the beloved disciple. and one that would go out and do this. Now, yes, John was an old man when he was on Patmos, but he wasn't that old. So we're thinking that that's maybe closer to 80 to 100 AD, because, again, what you're going to see are direct references to Revelation in the book of Hebrews. But before we go there, I've got to do some preliminary work with us, okay? Not quite a preamble, but yet a relevant understanding and discussion of time frames, and two of the topical areas that we're going to be very, very deeply involved in the book of Hebrews. So that being said, we want to go all the way back to the book of Genesis, okay? So yeah, no, he's not crazy. We're going on a little ride here. And we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 14. Now, I want to read some things to you, and I want you to please keep these in mind, because they are going to be extremely important in the conversation and the discussions that we have in Hebrews. So in Genesis, the 14th chapter, Abram, his name had not yet been changed to Abraham. Abram essentially refuses a reward. But listen to what happens in verse 17 of chapter 14. And the king of Sodom, we know about Sodom, right, went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Kedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. Listen now in verse 18. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. Abram tithed to Melchizedek. And then the king of Sodom said unto Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. But Abram said to the king, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. I will take nothing. Okay? Only what's my portion. That's it. Notice, though, Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Okay. It's important to understand, as you know, names and what they mean. So, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Not prince of righteousness. King of righteousness. And it says that he was the king of Salem. Salem means peace. It's the latter part of the full name of Jerusalem, or Jerusalema, which means, as we've spoken of before, God will provide himself a lamb in the city of peace. Okay, listen now. Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, where God will provide himself a lamb in the city of peace. Pretty much sounds like the Messianic promise, doesn't it? Yeshua, the Lamb, Jerusalem, King of righteousness. Another interesting point. Oh yeah, just one more thing. Remember about Joash, and we talked about Jezebel, and Joash means God has made himself a man. That's past tense. I'm going to leave you at that for a little bit. I'm going to start really understanding who Melchizedek was and ultimately who Yeshua is. The understanding of the full aspect of the Messianic promise. Okay. One other thing before we get really rolling here is, oh, by the way, let's just understand about when this portion of Genesis was written. And we're talking about the time frame of Abram. While the book was written about 1400, 1500 years BC, the time frame goes back to, it's got 5,000 years. When we see Melchizedek and Abram, and before Abraham even became, before the promise was actually given to that righteous man Abraham, okay? Father of many nations. And he said, because prior to Abram's understanding of the one true God, his name was Abram, and he was a stargazer. Essentially, he was an astrologer, okay? That blend of astrology and astronomy by looking at the stars and understanding times and seasons and motions, until he met God and realized that he was only dealing with the creation and not the creator. So when he realized that, he became a man of faith. His name was changed to Abraham, who would be the father of many nations. And we know the rest of the story. On and on and on and on. That's the beginning of it all. So we're about 4,000 or 5,000 years prior to what we're going to talk about now. And we're going to go to the book of Psalms. You say, Psalms? Yeah. And we're going to look primarily tonight at Psalm 110, which is one of the shortest psalms in the whole book, and is the most often quoted or referenced in the entire New Testament. And it has its place in numerous spots in Hebrews. So now, we talked about maybe 4,000 years or so having gone by in when Melchizedek appeared to Abram. And we come now to the Psalms, which were authored principally by David, but also by Asaph, the sons of Korah, and others. And the Psalms were developed between the dates 1000 down to 300 BC. So we got about a 700-year swing. And Psalm 110, based on what we do know about David and his life, was probably somewhere in around the 600, 650 BC type of time frame. So you can see that there's a leap. But it's important to understand the Psalms also were poetic. They were originally called the Sefer Tehillim, which means the book of praises. Psalms are songs, poetic songs, lyrics that were sung, okay, to the tune of a harp or a psaltery or a lyre. And this is how they conveyed ideas of rejoicing, of mercy, of loving kindness, praise, spoke of the enemy, spoke of the Lord, spoke of his righteousness. There was always something to sing about, and so they did. But in Psalm 110, let's take a look at it. It's probably one, if not one of, it's close to the shortest psalm in the whole book. And I want to read it to you. It's only 7 verses. Listen closely as we did in Genesis, because this will be very important as we go through Hebrews. Okay. Essentially, this is a prophecy of the coming of the priest, king, judge. The trifold aspect of the Messiah. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The Messiah was born a man filled with the Spirit of God. He has a threefold mission: as high priest, as king, judge. And these are over and above the things that he had to do to sacrifice as the Lamb, as the Messiah, the suffering servant. But the 3 other functions are high priest, and combination actually of king judge. So you have high priest, Messiah, and king judge, because the king rules with a rod of iron, which is the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. We know this. So that's the trifold aspect of what the Messiah is. And the manifestations of that messianic promise go all the way back to Genesis. Now, again, we're still in the preamble to Hebrews. Let's look at the rest of the whole of Psalm 110, a psalm attributed to David. The Lord said unto my Lord. The Lord, who? God said unto my Lord. Who's David's Lord? He didn't have one. Well, yes, he did. His future ancestor, Yeshua, the Messiah, the future king. That's his Lord. You can see the type of relationship that God had with David just in that first statement alone. Let's read on. Sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies a footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Then he says, rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. Sit thou on my right hand, and I'll make your enemies a footstool, and then rule over them. The people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent that thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord sat at thy right hand, shall strike through kings in the day of his wrath, and he shall judge among the heathen. He shall fill the places with the dead bodies. He shall wound the heads over many countries, and he shall drink of the brook in the way. Therefore shall he lift up the head. Everything we just read is a direct quote in the book of Revelation, which was written around the year 80 to 100 AD. Right here, where it's 650 at least BC. Very important. He mentions the roles and responsibilities, what the Messiah is going to do, how he's going to rule, who he's ruling over. High priest forever. King, judge, wound the heads of many countries. Remember we said the heads were the Rosh, the heads of nations, empires. That's what we're talking about here. And it's all directly in Revelation that we just finished up on last week. Okay, so now we take just a little bit more brief look or troop through that, just briefly. All right, because we know that this has to be, the Lord said this himself. It was written by David under the inspiration of the Spirit. Yeshua, Jesus himself, claims this in Matthew 22, verses 41 through 46. His argument turned on a couple of points here, specifically that David was the author of the psalm, and secondly, that David, inspired by the Spirit of God, called his son his Lord. David was the beginning of the messianic bloodline, the first. It wasn't Saul, the requested one. That's what Saul means in Hebrew. It was David, the beloved one. Very tricky. They're all very tricky. So we see this, and we have to make it has to be very clear in the way we understand this. All right, this is not something we can dance around. It all points there. There'll be more. Okay, so I hope that basically set a little bit of a tone for Hebrews. So let's go on over to the book of Hebrews. Let's open her up and let's start to get some general discussion going on what is really happening here. The entire book spoken to the Hebrew congregation of believers in the Messiah. Now remember, believers in the Messiah were being persecuted, hunted down like dogs, all right? Terrible. And this was going on, and these people are wondering, hey, the promise, where is it? Where is it? What's going on? Well, we're going to find out. Paul's going to lay that out, and he's going to talk to us about the superiority of our Messiah over all the prophets and everything that was spoken. And it has to do with how he was elevated to deity from a man, from flesh. Okay, so in the very beginning of Hebrews 1, God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spoke in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, and in these last days he's spoken us through his Son, whom he hath appointed the heir of all things, by whom also he made the world. What does that mean? Well, God breathed it. He spoke it. And it was. That word that he spoke was the beginning of all our understanding of God and the Messiah. His word became flesh. That's what we know. Okay? It says, who being the brightness, I said we're going to read, so we're going to read and understand. The brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholds all things by the word of his power, when he said by himself, purged our sins, and sat down at the right hand of majesty on high. Being made so much better than the angels, as he hath by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. For unto which of the angels did he say at any time, thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee? Never. And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Those words were never spoken by God to any angel. That's what this says. And again, when he brings the first begotten into the world, first begotten of God, the Spirit, he said, and let all the angels of God worship him. Let all the angels of God worship him. And of the angels, he said, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers, listen to this, a flame of fire, just like we read in Revelation. But to the Son, he says, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. Now, isn't it odd that when Jerusalem was being destroyed, the rabbis ran through the streets saying, we can't believe it, the temple's been destroyed and the Messiah hasn't come, because it is ingrained in Judaism that the Messiah would come before the temple was destroyed, before the scepter had to change hands, okay? And they said the scepter is not in the hands of Judah, it's not in the hands of Judah, when in fact it was in the hands of the Lion of the tribe of Judah that they didn't recognize. Thy kingdom. Thou hast loved righteousness and hated iniquity, and therefore God hated, even thy God hath anointed thee with all the oil of gladness above thy fellows. Okay? Now we're going to run out of time here in this first half, but the things that I'm quoting to you are essentially from Psalm 110, which we're going to go back and review. So let's take a short break for a couple minutes, think about this stuff, and we'll come right back. See you in a couple.